It was just another fiery political segment, until it wasn't. The cameras were rolling, the studio lights were hot, and the crowd leaned forward, sensing the tension even before it spilled into chaos. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat across from the host, exuding calm but focused energy. She had made a reputation for herself as someone who didn't flinch, didn't sugarcoat, and certainly didn't play nice when the stakes were this high. And tonight, the stakes were personal, for the Trump family, and more specifically, for young Barron Trump. The topic was already controversial, allegations swirling around the financial entanglements of America's most powerful families. But when Crockett shifted in her seat and looked dead into the camera, there was a sudden stillness. Even the host hesitated. Everyone watching could feel something was about to drop. "What the American people don't know," she began, "is that the Trump legacy doesn't just involve the former president. It stretches into the next generation. And we have to talk about it, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people." That's when it happened. Crockett laid out a series of shocking revelations that made every jaw in the studio drop. Documents, screenshots, and emails, allegedly connected to Barron Trump, were displayed on the screen behind her. She didn't accuse him of a crime, but what she did reveal was enough to shatter the image of the silent, distant son shielded from public scrutiny. Crockett's words cut through the air like glass. These communications show a network of private offshore accounts, mysterious cryptocurrency transfers, and untraceable funding that ties directly to shell companies, some registered when Barron was still a minor. But the fingerprints, they're all over it. At first, the audience didn't know what to do. Some gasped. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. And somewhere in that moment, the Trump estate erupted into chaos. Within minutes, the Trump PR team was scrambling, trying to control a wildfire that was already leaping through every corner of the internet. But the most shocking moment came minutes later, off-air. According to sources close to the Trump family, Barron Trump, still only just stepping into adulthood, was watching the broadcast live. His reaction wasn't fury. It wasn't denial. It was collapse. Physically and emotionally, the weight of Crockett's revelations hit him like a freight train. He reportedly fainted moments after the segment aired, surrounded by staff and family who were completely unprepared for the bombshell to go public. Medical teams were rushed in. Security was tripled. And within an hour, Donald Trump himself had released a statement calling the allegations slanderous, politically motivated, and a disgrace to journalism and American values. But it was too late. The footage of Crockett's composure, the documents flashing behind her, and the whispered panic across social media platforms had already done the damage. Political commentators were left stunned. Not just by the content of the revelations, but by the fact that Crockett had the courage to say it live, knowing the backlash would be nuclear. Some called her brave. Others called her reckless. But one thing was certain: nothing about the Trump legacy would ever look the same again. Back at the studio, after the cameras cut and the credits rolled, silence filled the room. Crockett sat quietly, staring into the middle distance. She knew the firestorm she'd unleashed, and yet she didn't blink. She had warned them. She had told her team this would ignite more than headlines, it would provoke war. And provoke it did. Trump loyalists immediately mobilized. Social media bots flooded platforms trying to discredit Crockett. Some claimed the documents were fake. Others tried to spin the story as an attack on a young man who never asked to be in the political spotlight. But supporters of Crockett weren't buying it. They pointed to the evidence, the patterns, the timeline, and they weren't backing down. As the hours turned into days, more details began to emerge. Investigations were quietly launched. Congressional inquiries loomed. Journalists worldwide began digging into the digital trail Crockett had revealed. And in the shadows, Barron Trump, once kept out of the limelight, had become a symbol of everything the Trump family had tried to hide. Some whispered that Barron was simply a victim of his environment. Others weren't so forgiving, arguing that influence comes with responsibility, and no one should be immune from accountability, not even the son of a former president. In the end, Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't take a victory lap. She simply issued one sentence in her final statement that echoed across media channels. When truth is inconvenient, the powerful will always call it an attack. And with that, the silence that followed was louder than anything she had said on live TV. No matter where you stood on the political spectrum, you couldn't deny it, Jasmine Crockett didn't just shake the table that night. She flipped it over, exposing secrets that could no longer be hidden, and in doing so, she forced a national reckoning that no one saw coming. And as for Barron Trump, collapsed, silent, and now thrust into the fire, it was no longer about his father's legacy. It was about his own. The key moment came when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward during the live broadcast, looked directly into the camera, and with the weight of purpose said, "America deserves the truth, and it starts with the next generation of the powerful." That single sentence landed like thunder across the nation, not because it was loud but because it pierced a veil that so many had carefully held in place for years. The idea that Barron Trump, the youngest and most private member of the Trump family, could be involved in something deeper, darker, and far more complex than the public had been led to believe seemed inconceivable to many. And yet here was Crockett holding documents, displaying timelines, and pointing out patterns that simply couldn't be dismissed by spin or distraction. She didn't accuse him of criminality, but what she presented painted a picture of a young man surrounded by shadows too large for his age, shadows cast by those who came before him. She highlighted the quiet financial movement, small at first but increasing in volume. Cryptocurrency wallets opened under aliases, transactions routed through Europe and the Caribbean, patterns that suggested knowledge networks and intent long before most teenagers would even know what an offshore account was. It wasn't a trial and it wasn't a conviction, it was a call to attention, and it shook everyone watching to their core. The audience in the studio sat frozen. The host didn't speak for a full 30 seconds after she finished. The control room buzzed with frantic producers trying to decide whether to cut to commercial. The network had expected fireworks, but they hadn't prepared for a nuclear blast. By the time the segment ended, social media had exploded. The name Barron Trump trended across every major platform. Conspiracy theorists, commentators, supporters, and critics alike all weighed in, some defending him, others dissecting every detail Crockett had revealed. But no one could change what had just happened live on national television. Meanwhile, the real fallout began behind the scenes. Sources later revealed that Barron had been watching the show alone in a secure part of the Trump estate. Reports say he didn't even finish the segment before collapsing onto the floor, overcome with shock, confusion, and the weight of a world that had just turned on its axis. Emergency medical personnel were called and family members rushed to his side, and chaos erupted within the walls of the Trump household. Donald Trump, himself reportedly furious, demanded immediate retaliation against the network, against Crockett, against anyone who had let this happen. But even he knew some lines couldn't be uncrossed. What Jasmine had said couldn't be unsaid, what she showed couldn't be unseen, and what Barron experienced in that moment couldn't be undone. And it wasn't just about one family. This moment sparked something deeper. It became symbolic of America's growing demand for transparency, accountability, and truth. Crockett later clarified she didn't enjoy revealing such sensitive matters involving someone so young, but she insisted it was necessary. She said the systems of power often hide behind youth, innocence, and the illusion of distance, but silence only allows manipulation to thrive. She insisted that the American people had a right to know how power is passed, how wealth is hidden, and how legacies are protected behind closed doors. Across the country, people debated, was it too far? Was it justified? Was Barron merely a casualty of a larger war, or was he more aware than anyone thought? Some called for compassion, others called for investigation, but no one could look away anymore. By the end of that week, several watchdog organizations called for congressional review of political family finances, citing what Crockett had revealed. They wanted to dig into the structures that allowed power to be inherited without oversight. The Trump legal team moved fast, threatening lawsuits, preparing counters, but the storm was already upon them, and in the center of it all, Barron Trump now sat, no longer invisible, no longer protected by silence and the grace of youth. He was part of the story now, perhaps unwillingly, perhaps unjustly, but undeniably. Jasmine Crockett didn't back down despite death threats, insults, and political backlash. She kept repeating one line in every interview: since the broadcast truth doesn't pick favorites and it doesn't knock politely, it enters loudly and without apology. It was that conviction that kept the story alive, not because people wanted to, tear someone down, but because they realized the rules weren't the same for everyone, and that realization echoed long after the studio lights dimmed in homes, schools, offices, and online spaces. Americans began to ask harder questions. How much of what we know is filtered? How much is hidden in plain sight? How many sons and daughters of the elite are quietly inheriting more than just wealth? Perhaps Crockett never intended to ruin anyone. Perhaps her aim was always to crack the armor around a political dynasty, but whatever her purpose, the effect was undeniable, and for Barron Trump, life would never be the same again. The collapse wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It was the moment a carefully curated silence was broken and the world heard what had been whispered behind closed doors for far too long.